Working Cows Podcast, episode 374. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. And this episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag. We've been fortunate to feature some of the world's leading regenerative ag and adaptive grazing experts on our show. And many of those experts are farmer, rancher instructors from the nonprofit Soil Health Academy. This year, you'll have several opportunities to experience and profit from attending one of their remarkable on-farm schools and workshops. Whether you're interested in learning more about diversifying corn and bean rotations to increase profitability, merging multiple species and marketing, grazing on the high plains and in northern environments, regenerative farming and ranching, or enhancing profits and production in your beef or dairy operation, the Soil Health Academy has a school for you. One of the best investments you can make is in yourself. So visit soilhealthacademy.org to learn more and register. Financial assistance scholarships are available. Very excited to be joined today by Luke Jones and Brian Dougherty, both part of the Understanding Ag team, and we're going to talk to them today about cover crops. We're going to talk all things cover crop. What's the goal of a cover crop? What are we trying to do on the landscape with a cover crop? What are some keys to success, ways to set yourself up for success, and ways to think about the different species mixes that we're using in cover crops. And then this is the Working Cows Podcast, right? We're going to talk about livestock integration into cover crops as well towards the end. So really excited to welcome Brian back and Luke for the first time. So Brian, Luke, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Good to be here, Clay.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, excited to have a conversation about cover crops. Fresh off of a Soil Health Academy myself. Luke, you're in Indiana, getting ready to teach one there. And, what kind of clicked for me, things that I got to hear with my own ears, see with my own eyes, is that when we start to institute these cover crops, that really what we're trying to do is speed up biological time. Am I remembering that right? Is that one of the ways that you guys at Understanding Ag talk about it? And what do you mean by that?
Yeah, cover crops definitely are an integral part in moving the whole soil health system. Ecosystem processes are regenerating our soils. Cover crops are a necessity. They're not the only tool that we look at, but they're definitely a necessity. They've been talked about for decades now. It's nothing new, but I think now that we're starting to get an understanding of what these cover crops actually bring to the table. Back when I first started understanding cover crops, it was a lot of monocrops, whether it's tillage radishes or just cereal rye only, things like that, or leftover wheat. But I think we've come so much further from that and understanding the diversity. And why was it the diversity was so key is it stimulates the biology in a way that, each of these different species, compounds are releasing different exudates that are stimulating the biology. And if we understand that the system that we are working with is biologically driven, then what better way to stimulate and prime them through diverse cover crops and getting them established in the system any way that we can to capture that all important for ecosystem processes of the energy cycle, right? One of my favorite things that I talk about and that excites me about this whole regenerative ag movement and building soil health is anytime you wake up in the morning, you've got a great day to make things happen, no matter what the system is. Get a living plant out there, capture that solar energy cycle, and let the whole chain of events happen from there. We are the biggest inhibitor of life on the operation ourselves and our management decisions. So I encourage it any way that I can get something out there growing. I don't look at anything as a weed anymore, even if it's an escape or something. It's there for a reason. It has a habitable environment to grow. So a cover crop could be a forb or a weed, as some might call it for me too, but it's there. It's got competition with some other cover crops, but getting those cover crops established to stimulate biology, feed their diet, if you will, is the initial first step for us to take forward.
And I guess when I get more one of those kind of ways that we want to frame that conversation too is picking the place to do a cover crop. And I don't never is a very strong word. when my wife and I were getting ready to get married, we had some people that were investing in our marriage even before we were married, and one of the things that they said is when you're fighting you shouldn't use words like always and never. So never's a strong word, but I would say that we could probably say we should never cover crop a perennial polyculture that's already existing. Like we shouldn't go plow up grass perennials and put in cover crops there, right? We should maybe use other management tools to try and make them more diverse, but probably not, burn them down and put a cover crop in there. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I'd agree. I'll start and I'll let Brian chime in. Yeah, it's kind of the actual reverse thinking here on that. If you want to try to establish perennials, we would recommend from a row crop situation or an arable situation, row crop land, in order to convert that to perennial, we would rather go with cover crops to get that established. But to revert back, for one, I would want to understand the context of what somebody is wanting to do with that piece of land from taking it out of perennial. The most drought resistant, the longest established, the most potentially productive grazing system there is right there, we would almost go backwards by reverting it out, unless something catastrophic happened where we needed to reset the system. But it's kind of the reverse thinking. We got other tools in the toolbox that play to build diversity and make that perennial system more profitable and productive than going backwards through the use of cover crops and added expenses in that direction. I'm happy to let Brian chime in as well on that.
Yeah, Luke hit all the main points I was thinking of as well. It really just doesn't make sense to tear up a perennial, like you said, and go back to annuals in a grazing system. You can use adaptive grazing as your tool, to get more diversity with longer rest periods. You can use stock density, lots of different management tools with the grazing side of it to improve that stand. And now we do get a lot of questions from people who have a perennial stand. They're, well, can I interseed some, maybe they're lacking the warm seasons. Can I interseed into that perennial stand with some, warm season annuals, for example, things like sorghum sudan? And yes, you can do that, but it tends to be difficult to get a good stand. That perennial mix is pretty competitive, and it's just generally doesn't turn out that well. So.
Yeah, and I think that, to your point, Brian, we've been managing this place that we're on now for about 5 years. 2 of those, maybe 3 of those, were pretty severe drought years. And this year, we've had probably the best 2 years back to back that we've had since we've been there, this year and last year. And what we're noticing is in some of those places, because it was all old hayfield, very dominated by crested wheat, pretty sparse, a lot of bare ground. But what we're noticing in some of those places, now that we've had good moisture back to back years, where we've had a few years of adaptive multi-paddock grazing style management, we're starting to see other things come in, and they maybe aren't, they're not the native warm seasons that we'd love to see eventually, but they're not, it's not only crested wheat anymore. That latent seed bank is starting to express itself. Now, this year, what I've been seeing is alfalfa, and obviously we don't want that to dominate the stand either, but it's better than, it's something, another plant species out there doing what it can do to help the soil get back in shape is better than just that basically monoculture of crested wheat. So I think, that's, at least in my experience, true, that just grazing right, eventually those hay fields will begin to rehabilitate themselves. Now, can we speed that process up? Maybe, but again, back to Luke's point, it's context. What is our context? What are we trying to accomplish? And then make our decisions from there. And I think that probably, at least in my mind, the scale is, if it's a monoculture of an introduced species like crested wheatgrass, maybe that helps us tip the scales a little bit more in favor of entertaining the idea of a cover crop. But it's still going to be a multi-year process to get back to a perennial polyculture if we're gonna go into cover crops. Is that true in your experience?
Yeah, Clay, and to that, like you're saying, you had some drought periods there. We can do everything right, but if it doesn't rain, the deck's against us. We can only do so many things that compensate for lack of moisture. But we as humans, our first inclination is to go in there and we got to do to fix this. We're going to throw all the cards on the table, throw the money at, throw in cover crop seeds. Well, if you're not getting enough moisture to get your forage to produce anyway, why do we think, even though it's a better, maybe a potentially better cover crop that'll utilize moisture a little bit more efficiently, but it still takes moisture for those, added seeds in that system to grow and do their job. So the steps that it would take for us to get those established, whether herbicide, tillage, more drilling, copse of seed, everything that we've taken there to do that, maybe the best plan of attack would have been to destock or forego that ground a little bit just to let it actually do its job. Because as you said, now that you've got a little moisture, how much better that ground has responded to that proper management. So I'm not going to cast stones at anybody that feels like they need to try to improve their system at all, but I think there's better things that we can do. Rest and just deferring that ground a little bit in those types of situations versus trying to maximize every little ounce out of it when it's really exhausting it, if you will.
When we talk about speeding up biological time, what is that journey like? Where are we starting and where are we ending? What is the target we're shooting at when we're trying to speed up that biological time?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's pretty variable. Every environment, every climate is going to respond differently. The level of intent that you have as far as being dedicated to getting diverse living roots in that system, they're all going to respond differently. So the wonderful thing about the regenerative standpoint here is that there's no recipe, there's no formula. The only formula that I believe in is 634. That's an understanding. That's our platform that we stand on. That's the only formula that's all inclusive that goes across every acre. How that fits into your context, that number one principle, that's where we got to go with this. But as far as timing, typically the 3 to 5 year period is what we like to see things start to crank and turn around. A lot of people say they want to focus more on their degraded land. Well, that's great that you can. I would probably watch my cost of seed on those acres. Because you're probably going to get a slower turnaround on those. Whereas if I'm going to start to increase biological activity, I'd probably even look at some of my more productive ground and have my better utilization of money invested there to really see some return on that. But that degraded soil still needs some roots in there to get it to start to come to life, if you will, and get some oxygen breathed into that soil.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like Luke said, it's a tough question to answer because it comes back to the context. If your goal, we always come back to somebody wants to plant a cover crop. Well, the first question is, what is your goal? What are you trying to do? So if your goal is to speed up biological time, there's some different indicators, I guess you could say, that you could use to assess that. Our favorite, obviously, is soil aggregation. So just get out there with a shovel and see, do you have any aggregation and how deep is it? So that's your number one, visual assessment you can do right there. Just how well aggregated is it? Your goal really should be to have a well aggregated soil. So if you've got that, a lot of things are just going to start to work. And then if you really want to get in and look at the biology, there's testing we can do. We can run the phospholipid fatty acid or PLFA test and look at the mycorrhizal fungi. That'd be the big one there, and protozoa, if you have those or don't have them, and what are your levels. So those could give you some more concrete goals to shoot for if you wanted to have a specific target.
Yeah, and I think that when we're talking about biological time, we're talking about the biological community that's present in the soil, right? That's what you're talking about there a little bit, the mycorrhizal fungi and the protozoa. But in systems that are less healthy, as I understand it, more often than not, they are dominated by a bacterial community. And in systems that are more healthy, again, as I understand it, they're dominated by a fungal community. Is that accurate?
That's the old rule of thumb, anyway, that they say. But I think that, especially here where Brian and I are primarily out in the row crop world, if we get everything to drive heavily fungal, well, we're going to revert back to timbers and things like that, more brushy species. And we got to find that balance. So I think our job here in the Midwest and on the row crop systems, more importantly, is to find that balance of fungal and bacterial ratio. It still takes bacteria. You know, you hear a lot of people say they want a 1-to-1 ratio. Well, that's good and it sounds good on paper, but to me, I just want as much bacteria and as much fungi and much protozoa. I want it to all and let them balance them out. You know, Ray Archuleta, like we said, met with Ray Archuleta, Mother Nature self-healing, self-regulating, self-organizing, if we allow it. So we got to work within that. But yeah, it's that is the true statement that they always say: the more healthy, the more fungal. But you know, back to your question on that biological priming, though, that I wanted to readdress. So just for an example myself, so some of the timber soil that I farm for row crop is very degraded, very thin, very white, if you will. We call it white sugar soil. Built some fence on it a couple of years ago with the intent of getting livestock back on the ground. And this ground it was very conventionally farmed up until I started taking it over here a couple of years ago. I seeded a cool season mix on it, and this farm had not seen livestock in over 70 years. This was my grandparents' farm. So I built fence on it, put cattle out there. I got the video of the cattle going out there for the first time in over seven decades. Very bacterial dominant soil, very degraded, lack of diversity other than weeds, forbs, if you will. But within that first round of grazing, we had dung beetles coming in. And if you dug up that soil, just looking at the aggregation and the rise of sheaths on those roots. So I don't know how that happened, but it did. You know, so it's just one of those things, timing wise, it can happen within that first year. There's something about good systems, or I don't know if there's some kind of radar shooting up out of the ground that says, come here, there's life here, but it can happen very fast.
What we do know about dung beetles is they have wings, right?
That's right. They'll find it. They will find it.
If you build it, they will come.
But it's just crazy that even within I'm talking a 7-acre piece in, you know, a zit on an elephant's butt in our landscape, and they found it.
Yep. Same here. It was, you know, first week of turning livestock out in our neighborhood. You know, and that was not the first thing, but one of the first things we ask people who are going to send us custom grazing livestock is, could you refrain from any applications of dewormers or pesticides in the, you know, at least 3 months before they come to us. If they've never had it, that's even better. But, you know, yep. And I've never failed to be able to find dung beetles in a manure pat, you know, in the years that we've had livestock coming. So, and it was like very quick.
Yeah. And to prime that biology in the soil, there's no better way. You know, I think all of the stuff that we're applying, a lot of the things we're doing, we're just trying to mimic what the ruminants did for the landscapes through their saliva, their manure, their dandruff, you name it. No bug in a jug that you can buy will mimic what the ruminants will do. So you want to talk about expediting that biological process or the inventory there, get ruminants on the ground. That's critical, because we're only just trying to mimic what they did.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Brian, you had something to add there? Or?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we do tend to have very bacterially dominated soils in our cropping systems, and kind of have to step back to understand why that's happening. If you think about natural succession, you know, say a hurricane, tornado, whatever, something comes through and just wipes the slate clean, you're going to start with a very bacterially dominated, and then over time it's going to become more and more fungal. Eventually you end up with the climax ecosystem with lots of trees and that sort of thing. But in an annual cropping system, we basically kind of get to the point where we're starting to see like the annual weeds, you know, getting a little bit more fungal, but then every year we hit the reset button. You know, if you go in with tillage, if you're using herbicides, fungicides, especially, bacteria, they're tough little buggers. They can withstand just about anything. We always have bacteria, but the fungi are much more sensitive to those disturbances. So in these annual systems, we just keep hitting the reset button every year and kind of driving that ratio back towards fungal dominance. So a lot of what we work on with producers is just figuring out how do we minimize some of that disruption. That's one of our big soil health principles. And the reason that works is because it allows that soil to heal and allows your fungal populations, especially your mycorrhizal fungi, to recolonize that soil.
Certainly. One of the things that you mentioned in this process of, you know, just assessing where you're at is, get out there and examine the aggregation. And now it's been all of 5 days, I think, since I left the Soil Health Academy. But if I remember right, the 4 tools that we should be using to examine soil health is the shovel, the thermometer, the grazing stick, and the refractometer. I'm not sure about the grazing stick; it might be something else. But though I know I'm pretty confident on those 3 for sure: the shovel, the thermometer, and the refractometer. Is that I'm right about that? Is there, what was the 4th one? The grazing stick? Is it a different one that I forgot?
We recommend like an infiltration, doing some infiltration tests.
That's it. The infiltration ring.
Yep.
Okay. So, but we're examining the aggregation with, really, we're examining the aggregation for sure with the shovel and the infiltration ring, right? That those 2 things kind of tell you about how fast you can get water into the soil and how much water it can hold. And then they just talk a little bit about, using these tools and examining where we're at and kind of how that can help us inform some of what we're trying to do with the cover crops.
Yeah, you bet. So I guess I can start off, and Brian, you can follow up. But the simplest thing to do is, get the spade out. If anybody you're working with doesn't show up to your farm with a spade, fire them. They're not worth they're not worth your time. They're there to sell you something. So if somebody shows up with a spade, at least they have some kind of inclination of what's going on underneath the soil, or at least they're willing to put a little work in. So dig that spade up. How easy does a spade go into the ground, right? Check it against your cropping fields. Check it against your fence rows. Find those undisturbed areas so that you can at least feel for yourself and keep those in your mind when you're doing and digging around. And when you dig up those soils, how do they look? How do they ply up out of the soil? Or is it hard? Does it rip and tear? Do you hear roots ripping and tearing? Those are sounds and things that you can listen for. Use your senses while you're doing all these things: sight, sound, smells, you name it. As you dig up that spade of soil, I like to, off the shear side, I like to just break it down the middle and really get an observation of what that soil looks like without being cut through with the spade. But then we look for the aggregation, as Brian has talked about here, and it's that: do we have that chocolate cake? Some say cottage cheese. I prefer chocolate cake over cottage cheese by a long ways. So does it look like a chocolate cake? That porosity, the crumbly, granular kind of structure. How deep is that? Can you see that layer of carbon that we're pumping into that system? Do you see that moving deeper? And take these samples and compare them to each other from the row crop and the undisturbed area, or minimized disturbed area. Look for that. What's the temperature feel like? Use your thermometer. Look at the surface temperature. Get the probe from that thermometer and check the 4-inch temperature. See what the differences are there. I was out in Kansas a couple of years ago and seen a guy doing some tillage work after wheat harvest, and I couldn't help but not go in there and see what the status was. The gentleman was at the far end of the field, so I knew he wasn't going to come up there and catch me as slow as the pace as he was going tilling that field. But I slipped out into the field, and the soil temperature was 141 degrees, the soil. So I went out on the oil and chip blacktop road that I drove in on. It was 129. Okay, so our soils are hotter than asphalt, and that shouldn't make sense. But it's just those observations like that we need to be making. So we're definitely lacking armor, lacking aggregation to help oxygen staying in that soil. Those are the things that we like to look for with the spade. And then the infiltration test. Get you a water bottle. 444 mils is the equivalent of an inch of rainfall. So get you a water bottle, dump it out about where the neck tapers down. It's close enough, and then time it. If you're sitting there past 10 minutes, kick it out and move on. No, you got better things to do. You can sit there and watch it if you want to, or leave it and come back and check it. But I got too many other irons in the fire. So if it's 10 minutes, I'm kicking it out and moving on. But observe how fast that water's infiltrating. Observe the conditions that when you did that. Was it rainy before? It's going to be reduced infiltration prior to that. If we had rain prior to doing that test. Things like that. And then the refractometer, as we improve aggregation, as we pump more carbon into the system, build more soil health, those Brix levels will start to increase as well. And Brian, you can chime in whatever else you'd like to on that as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say on the infiltration, obviously incredibly important. So that's really going to give us a good indication of, do we have those macropores in the soil? Because about 70% of your infiltration rate, it's actually the big macropores that are made by, say, earthworm channels or old root channels or something like that. And so again, if you've got too much disturbance, you're not going to have that. It's going to shut down your infiltration rate. So I like to see it under 5. Even a minute or two for that first inch in a really healthy soil is entirely achievable. The other one I like to do out in the field is just looking at how stable are those aggregates. So super easy test. Just get yourself a little scoop of water, take a little pad of soil and drop it in there and just let it sit for about 30 seconds and see if it falls apart. And then give it a quick swirl for maybe 5 seconds again, see if it falls apart. If you have the biological glues that you need for stable aggregation, that little pad of soil should hold together and that water should stay clear. So another super simple, easy test you can do in the field. If you really want to know how are you doing on aggregation, not only how does it look, but how stable are those aggregates? Because they're constantly being formed and broken down in the soil by the biology. So the numbers that I've heard, somewhere around 4 weeks is about how long an aggregate actually lasts. So if you think about that, if you go longer than 4 weeks without a living root, you're going to start losing aggregation. You're going to start losing those biological glues that hold those aggregates together.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. We've been fortunate to feature a number of Understanding Ag's regenerative farming and ranching experts on the podcast over the years. In that time, Understanding Ag's reputation for helping producers understand and successfully and profitably apply money-saving regenerative principles and practices has only grown. And there are two primary reasons for that. First, Understanding Ag's consultants are farmers and ranchers who've been there, done that on their own regenerative farms. And second, Understanding Ag's consultants aren't in the business to sell you costly inputs. They get no commissions and you get no pressure. Just profit-building solutions for your operation. Learn more at understandingag.com and discover the hope in healthy soil. That's www.understandingag.com. I think it would probably be fair to say that on the mean, or in the mean, on average, many of our, especially row crop acres, but many of our agricultural acres in general in America are going to tend to be bacterially dominated and not well aggregated. And so we could just say, here's something to consider. We're not giving you a recipe, the 6, the 3, and the 4. Those are principles. They apply everywhere. They work everywhere. They're tried. But what are we going to do if we do come to a field and it's not well aggregated and it is not a healthy soil? How are we going? What's our strategy going to be on those acres with that cover crop? And we'll just start in the spring of the year. Say we're starting with our early, or maybe even we'll just start in the spring of the year. What are we going to do for the spring of the year to try and start moving that field in the right direction?
Yeah, starting off with spring that year, as far as cover crops, your options are pretty limited there. I mean, maybe if you're early enough, some oats and peas potentially ahead of corn. I know there are some spring seeded, spring cereals, winter cereals, tree kale, things like that could be done ahead of beans. In the springtime, though, it gets tough. Trying to get something established there. I'd probably more so look at what am I doing otherwise, physical disturbances that I can reduce to start moving that needle to possibly get the ball rolling better for a fall seeding or late summer seeding. Depends on what the crop is going to be there. It's the whole it depends button. There's a lot of variables there. But definitely if it's going to corn, can I no-till? Is the ground in good enough situation where I can no-till? If it's been fall plowed, obviously, you set the stage in the fall. If you hit that first ripper pass, well, you're gonna have to strike it off and level it off. So what are we doing now to build aggregates? We obviously probably have reduced soil armor. So the needles moved against us pretty hard here. So in the spring, it gets a little tough. Does it have to be corn or soybeans? Is this an opportunity to get a diverse oat crop in the system if there's a market there? This all comes down to what the individual is willing to do and their economic context, what's their market context. This all weighs on them, and we can work through these situations with each producer. Has there been fall applied fertility that's potentially set our aggregation potential building back? And most of the time that's the case, especially in the row crop world. A lot of fall applied fertility, and we're seeing that in masses. So really starting to reduce my tillage passes. What am I doing for my herbicide programs? Um, most of the times we do a blanket application of herbicide. I used to work in ag retail, and pretty much it was a figure up a prescription. It was on every acre, whether it's corn or soybeans. That's what you're going to do. Here's your corn program. Here's your soybean program. Regardless of what your weed pressures are, this is what we're going to run because it nukes everything, and we don't have to worry about weed X, Y, Z. So can we reduce those? Do we really have that bad a weed pressure that we're applying excess amounts of herbicides out there? Then it comes time in the season here where we're talking about fungicide and insecticides. Do we really need that fungicide? If we're planting early, potentially you probably are going to need it, but there's a reason for that, right? So if we wait a little later for that soil to warm up, can we potentially pull away from some of that fungicide? I believe so. Yep. That's probably one of the first things that I feel confident in pulling away from is some of this seed treatment, especially on soybeans. They're very resilient. The populations we plant them at, I've had no issues pulling away my seed treatment there. So then you think about the rule of compounding. What does that do for us? Well, potential knocking out some insect populations. We always hear Jonathan Lundgren say for every one pest, there's 1,700 other beneficials. Well, people that have battle with slugs, things like that. Well, if you apply that seed treatment, that neonic on that soybean, well, the slugs are going to drag that across and start to tear out a lot of your ground beetles, which is the actual predator for some of these other issues that we've got in there. So it's just a rule of compounding there. The more we can start to pull away from some of those, if they're able to, and if they're willing and can potentially, if they economically can afford it, it all depends on their goals and their visions. What do they want to achieve here? As we move into the fall, it gets a lot easier though. As far as determining how you can start to improve that soil. Sometimes in the spring of the year, you just almost have to deal with that in a row crop world. But in the fall, maybe in that springtime, like you said, maybe I thought, well, if I want to get something established here this fall, this gives me the opportunity to bump my maturities up so I can get in there in a timelier manner and get something established and have a better success rate. A lot of people are chasing yield, which I get it. Yield is part of the equation. But we're still seeing very economical yields, even by bumping some of these maturities up. Understanding your different application methods of getting some of these cover crops established are critical. There's aerial, drone work now, interseeding if you're in a more northern climate. There's all those tools in the toolbox to work, but sometimes you got to shoot from the hip, and if there's weather coming in that looks favorable to get some stuff established, do it. Take the opportunity, but don't make sure you understand what species you're trying to establish as well. But starting out, I want to get a lot of grassroots species in there, get some fibrous roots in there to start breaking up that compaction layer, those platy soils, and let those grow. Following that into the next year, you need to watch the weather. I've had times where it's bit me in the butt where I probably should have terminated that cover crop a little sooner by not observing the weather properly. So those are things you got to watch. It's not an easy game. It's a thinking's main game. So you got to play the variables, watch out for it, and really understand what you want that cover crop to do for you, and then manage it accordingly.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at with that question, is kind of the different roots, root systems and what they're doing in those soils to really kind of move the needle in the direction that you want to go. And also that's what I'm hoping to do here for a little bit here on this episode, is just to take a journey through the year. Like, what are we doing? And we've talked about the spring's kind of hard. We really need to be starting before that, but we got to start somewhere in the year. So we've got our corn crop in, corn crops harvested. Now we're thinking about planting something to follow that. And I think that's maybe a missing link in a lot of cases, is we've taken the cash grain crop off and now it's okay, corn, soybeans, Florida, that's our crop rotation, rather than actually trying to do something that's going to keep a living root in the soil, reduce our need for chemical and mechanical disturbances going forward, some of those things. So Brian, anything to add there, or anything else that you would want us to talk about before we talk about what to follow the corn or beans with and where to go from there?
Yeah, I think Luke wrapped it up pretty good there. But yeah, spring is definitely when you need to be planning and thinking about fall. If you're going to be serious and you're going to be intentional about cover cropping, you got to be thinking ahead. Like you said, it's a thinking man's game, and don't wait until October to order your cover crop seed. If you're planning to plant a cover crop in October, you need to be planning this stuff out months in advance. It's a system. You need to be giving just as much thought to that cover crop as you are to your cash crops if you're going to be successful with them.
So where do we go from cover crop or from cash crop harvest? We've got that We've got that cover crop seed, as Brian just said. We've got it already there, ready to go. We've had it. Had this plan in place. What are some of the things that help frame in our thinking there and the strategy?
Yeah, a lot of that decision is going to come back to, what do you got for equipment and what do you have for time and manpower? So are you going to drill that after harvest? Are you going to try to broadcast it and work it in? Are you going to try to fly it on before harvest? Any of those can work potentially. Drilling almost always is going to get you the best stand, but it is going to go in later. So that's going to limit the species that you have to choose from. So you really got to think about the calendar, where you're going to be at when you seed, and that's going to inform which species are going to work for you and, how you're going to manage that.
Talk to me a little bit about kind of the diversity of these cover crops and some of the things that you're thinking about there as far as strategy goes.
Yeah, as far as diversity, we'd like to see, and we have the rule of three, 3 grasses, 3 legumes, 3 forbs. That's a 9-way mix right there, which is way more diverse than what most people are going to plant. So obviously, if you're going to do that, you need to be probably, if you're in the upper Midwest here, sometime in August or September to be successful with that. But generally, the more diversity you can get out there, the better that cover crop's going to work. So grasses are great for breaking up surface compaction. They put out a lot of root mass, great for protecting from erosion. So they definitely have a benefit. But if we really want to drive aggregation deep, we have to have that diversity and those crops having that synergistic effect happening underground. We need some forbs in that mix, some broadleaves to put down deep tap roots and work, synergistically with those grasses if we really want to make some longer term gains in soil health. So diversity is just such a critical piece that I think is kind of overlooked or not given enough emphasis especially in our corn and bean systems, where we're lacking any diversity in the cash crop part of it.
And again, diversity comes up in all 3 of the 6, the 3 and the 4, right? And so we need to, we can't really hammer that point hard enough that it is an integral part of this. And when you go out into those perennial polycultures in a range setting, that's what you're going to see is diversity, in healthy ones, right? In less healthy ones, less diversity, but you're going to find diversity in those. And that's really what we're doing with these cover crops, is trying to mimic nature, trying to get those things out there, get the diversity out there that attracts a diversity of soil biology and all of those things. So I think that's an important piece to not overlook for sure.
I was just going to say, each plant has a slightly different microbiome that's associated with it. They're all feeding different critters in the soil. And if we want to get at nutrient cycling, which is usually one of the goals in our crop systems, we want that cover crop to do something for us. We want it to make nutrients available. We want it to fix some nitrogen. And if you don't have diversity out there, that is just not going to happen. You got to have multiple species out there that are going to get your phosphorus solubilizing bacteria, your free living nitrogen fixers, all of those things, that we need the aggregation, but we also need the diverse root system to go with that if you want to have good nutrient cycling.
I would even echo that, Brian. Even starting out, we used to, tread lightly, and we try to work within the client's context as far as what their comfortability level is on working with these cover crops. But I think they're going to be much happier, even if they just go with three cereals to start off with instead of just rye. Plant 3 cereals. At least get something out there with Nebraska, something. Then if you get comfortable there, you can start to add in more. But for me, I'm going crazy enough that I want as much flowering species too. So I'm looking at flower shops, anything I can throw in there for my summer annual mixes, which we'll touch on that a bit. But anything to get something flowering out there, I don't care. I just want something that's going to increase diversity for my insects as well. Because for me to have this whole system cycling and functioning properly, I need the predators above ground as well. But that's what I'm looking at. And they've got species like annual ryegrass, not cereal rye, but the really small seeded annual ryegrass, very, very good cover crop, but the management level is not something to shy away from on that. So it's not for any early beginner. I would say start with your small grains to start off with for sure, but it's got a lot of great compounds to it, breaking up hard pans and it's just got an incredible root growth. But that's where I would not start with something like that in the mix.
Yeah, as far as cover crops throughout the year, kind of getting things harvested off in the fall, planting this cover crop for for the through the winter. What are we thinking about come the spring? Kind of bringing that full circle, that conversation full circle. What are we thinking about for the spring and some of the strategy there?
Yeah, so for the spring, you better understand what tools you have at hand to manage that cover crop prior to planting the cash crop. Whether you're going to plant on herbicide, whether you're organic and you have to relate to tillage to make that happen. Is it a roller crimper, mowing, grazing? What options are you going to use to manage that cover crop? You need to be thinking of that ahead of time, and you need to have some backup plans if something goes wrong, if it gets wet or if it gets dry. You need to have some multiple strategies laid out for that. We've seen that a lot here this year. Guys were probably pretty quick to pull the trigger on everything, killing cover crops off, but then we hit a little wet spell there, and I think that it kind of set some folks back in the cover crop world because that ground just didn't dry out very fast. But if we had a living root there, we were able to kind of help regulate that moisture in the soil. So I guess my point there is don't treat every acre the same. If you are going to terminate, maybe terminate some of your drier ground. But if you got some lower wet laying ground, maybe give it a chance to stay there and do the job for you. So make sure you know what tools you have and work with somebody, understand what access they have to tools as well. Don't just go buy equipment just to think you're going to do it and jump in. Work with it before you buy it and make the investment on that. But also, if you want some accumulation to build some real biomass, myself this year, I had almost 5-ton biomass that I no-tilled corn into. I was patient, which I had to be patient because I was overseas and my wife was soon to be delivering child number 4. So I had no other choice but to sit on my hands. And I'm glad I did. It was definitely I'll never say failure. It was a learning year for sure. Every year is a learning year because I want those to help me be a better manager of those cover crops. So some might say that I failed, but I learned something too. So that's how I look at it. And don't be afraid of that. I think, especially in the row crop world, everybody hates to have something potentially look bad. I mean, it is such an aesthetic game. You want to see this lush green, just pretty, no weed, clean mowed roadsides. That's the picturesque row crop world. And I think we need to get away from that. That's just so boring to me. I mean, I've seen more things happen to the positive as far as biodiversity by delaying mowing until after August 1st. And that's just so I can get some stuff knocked back to make harvest a little easier. We've got to change the attitude there as far as what pretty is. And a lot of people think that corn needs to look just phenomenal coming out of the ground. Some of mine looked pretty spindly, pretty tough coming through some of that cover crop. But right now, other than being a couple leaf stages behind and tasseling, color looks just as good as anybody else's with only 70 pounds of nitrogen applied on it. So it all depends on what somebody's willing to take a gamble on and play with. But you need to understand that if you want to terminate that cover crop sooner, you're probably going to have to do it with a herbicide more so than likely. That cover crop is going to break down sooner due to its lower seed-end ratio. For me, I like to see that cover crop in that 20 to 24 to 1 seed-end ratio of a good balanced mix, because that's going to be my slow release fertility throughout the growing season. And that's what I want. Plus, it's going to build me armor on the soil, not only to help maintain moisture, but to protect that soil from erosion. But build the habitat for the biodiversity that I want to come in there, and it just starts to compound from there, protect it from the sunlight, all the good things like that. So that's my approach on that.
That's a carbon to nitrogen ratio, the C to N ratio.
C to N, right? That's correct. Yeah.
Your preference just happens to be the ideal for biology, right? 24 to 1.
Yeah, I'm not that smart. I go by the charts.
We talk a lot about carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that's something really important for people to understand where that's at. So if you're going to grow corn, for example, and you've got a grass cover crop ahead of that, so you've got a grass going into a grass, to be on the safe side, you're probably going to want to terminate that a little bit sooner and have a little bit lower ratio there on the carbon to nitrogen, or change your nitrogen management so that you've got enough nitrogen early season to break that cover crop down. Whereas, say, going to soybeans, little bit safer bet to let that go ahead and grow. You can get up 35, 40 to 1 carbon to nitrogen on that. And that can actually be a good strategy. So again, what's your goal? Do you want surface armor? If you terminate it early, you're not going to have surface armor. It's going to melt away pretty fast. Whereas if you're going to plant soybeans green into rye and let it go and roll it down later, that's a great strategy for building armor, and especially for weed control. Seen some pretty fantastic results holding back water hemp and Palmer amaranth and things like that, eliminating the spray pass with that kind of a strategy. So you just got to ask yourself, what is it you're trying to accomplish in the spring with that cover crop?
I've heard, I'm row crop illiterate, so just throw that out there. But I've heard that it's like 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel of yield. Is that kind of average, right?
For corn, 1 to 1.2 is what pretty much standard people are doing, but there's some folks moving that needle lower. Yeah.
Right. But I mean, you said 70 pounds, so I'm assuming you're planning to yield more than 70 pounds to the acre. Is that right?
Yeah, I'll have a higher
bushel to the acre, I mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's all
For
I'm
sure.
saying is that just think about the reduced need for nitrogen when you've got that carbon on the ground already, and that nitrogen, you've got, like it said, the free living organisms that can fix nitrogen for you, and some of the other things going on there. I don't know all of what's going on there, but some of those things are helping, and always good to be able to reduce that cost for one. And then also, I've heard, again, things that I've heard secondhand, things I haven't experienced myself necessarily, but when you do apply nitrogen, a lot of times you end up shooting yourself in the foot because the biology eats the carbon and then you're left with no ground cover. Is that kind of go into some of what you're thinking there?
Yeah, it all works together. The system is it's not easy. If you step back with your hands involved with it, it sounds fairly simple. Plant seed, harvest seed, but there's a lot that goes in between here and there. Your management level definitely increases with cover crops. As Brian, he pointed out a lot of great things like water hemp, Palmer amaranth reduction with the rye. But you still have to understand the system that you're in. What are the climate conditions? Because just as good as it can be equally bad. I've seen some train wrecks where guys didn't terminate early, or they let it go too long, and then they didn't use the proper equipment to get the stuff established. And I've seen it go backwards. But I'm tired of people saying the cover crop did this or the cover crop failed me. No, better yet, you failed your cover crop. You didn't understand how to properly manage that. So I just want to full stop that right there. I mean, I get frustrated seeing that because everybody's trying to put down cover crops for the negative. But really, as Gabe says, if you don't like what you see, go home, look in the mirror, and the answer's right there, looking back at you. Simply put, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I guess go back to, what was your question again on that? I got on a sidetrack there. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. I was just talking about kind of the fact that we're managing this carbon nitrogen ratio, and sometimes nitrogen exacerbates the problem of a lack of carbon on the soil surface.
Yeah, and I'll quote Brian Dougherty here since he's on the call. It's kind of if you apply more, you need more. He said that a lot in some presentations, and I couldn't agree more with that. We get in this system where we think we're going to solve this. We got to have it looking pretty. We got to apply this, but now we need to apply more. Well, we've loaded this plant with extra nitrates. Well, now it's going to be probably more susceptible to disease. So now we're going to need more fungicide. Just the whole hamster wheel just keeps spinning in our row crop world, and it's frustrating to see. I've spent many years playing in it, keeping it going along as it is today. But you hit a wall at some point and think that this game is not you're not going to the poker table to win. I'll guarantee you this. The guys dealing the cards, the guys that's taking the money as you go in this casino, they're the ones making the money. So it gets frustrating to see this. And I hate seeing the current mental state in agriculture right now. We're seeing corn prices drop below $4 pretty soon. They're not there yet, but if I'm sure local delivery is below $4, that's making some guys that have already put the money on the poker table starting last fall for $5 to almost $7 corn at some points to really gamble hard. But pressure's pushed against us now. So how can we work more with this biologically? Get that cover crop out there. Yeah, it costs money, but it can also make you money if you manage it properly. Reducing those inputs, utilizing what that plant has taken up, and understanding that we're probably not being very good stewards of the nutrients that we are applying. It's not just, we've talked about before, it's not just switching to no-till. It's not just planting cover crops. It's not just the 4 nutrient strategy program. It's all of them combined that's going to make this system work. So we can't cherry pick and expect everything to work perfectly. It's not going to. Mother Nature does not ever work like we expect her to. She's always batting last. She's batting 1,000. She's never lost a game in her life. But how well we work within her context as much as possible will set us up for the best potential success. So, I'm, ahead of my corn crop. I'm definitely balancing out that seed in ratio. I'm applying a little bit of nitrogen at planting time. And if it looks like I've got enough accumulated in that cover crop through some biomass testing, shipping those off, pulling some Haneys to go along with that and PLFAs, then I can start to play the game of how much can I cut back here? How low can I go? And, it's as of right now, 70 pounds with what I've got on with the cover crop is going to take me through to harvest.
Well, and you find yourself on that hamster wheel of just adding a little bit more all the time. I think Monty Bottons would say that makes you a moron. You just got to go out there and put a little more on. And
yeah.
And so if we haven't offended everybody, we'll turn to talking about cows here after I let Brian say what he had to say.
I was just going to say one tool we haven't touched on yet is biomass sampling. So it's nice to know what you have out there. A lot of people don't want to mess with it, but right before you terminate that cover crop, just go out, measure out an area so you know how much you're collecting, cut it off at the ground and send it into the lab, and just have a biomass analysis done. How many pounds, you'd be amazed sometimes at how many pounds of nitrogen and phos and potassium and micronutrients that are actually pulled up by that cover crop. To me, that's your fertilizer truck. So do you want to pay the co-op to come out and spread 150 pounds of potash when you got 400 pounds of it standing there in your cover crop? I mean, that's your surface fertility application as that breaks down. So it's just a different mindset. And if you don't run that test, you're never going to know what you have out there. Now, are you going to get all those nutrients back right away that first year? No, you might not get any of that nitrogen depending on, again, how high is your carbon to nitrogen ratio? What's the temperature? How much moisture do you have? All these things play a role. So it's difficult to predict exactly what you're going to get when, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle. And or if you at least do it once, if you've never taken a biomass sample, just to see what that cover crop's doing.
So yeah, this is the Working Cows podcast. After all, I'd like to turn to talking about livestock integration a little bit, grazing cover crops, and how they fit into this system that we've been talking about. We've been talking about a cash grain system mostly, where we're using cover crops as a bridge from one crop to the next, and some of those things. Where do livestock fit into this system that we've been describing?
And to me, it's a no-brainer. But I also want to step back and say the soil first, the livestock and the soil first. We have to take care of them, and that's through living plants, right? We always say healthy soil, healthy plants. Well, what comes after healthy plants? Healthy animals. So we got to understand the hierarchy there. Take care of the animals in the soil first. Dave Brandt done a phenomenal job building soils, improving his soils just through cover crops, living roots, crop rotation, diversity, armor, reducing its disturbances, you name it. But the one thing he did not have was integrated ruminants. I think that is the cherry on top of the whole sundae here that we're snacking on in this regenerative movement. But it's not for everybody also. Some folks are just so spread out on a scale. Their farm is a business and they don't have time to jack with it. But I also think livestock, to really make this thing scale and go exponentially further, what a great opportunity to bring Junior back to the farm or have somebody else's kid in the neighborhood that's interested in farming or interested in grading livestock to understand how to properly adaptively graze livestock on those row crop acres is a win-win-win for everybody. It's a win for our communities for sure, by getting those animals out there, helping to reduce, wind erosion, nitrates in the water. I mean, you just name it. What cover crops can do, that's great, but what cattle can do to the cover crops as well, that's a whole other story. Because if we understand what cow takes in, about 70% of that's going to come out the backside. What a great way to cycle some of those nutrients and get them into a readily available form for that next crash crop. But I think ruminants are critical. I can't stress that enough. I mean, I'd love to see animals across every acre in the Midwest. Will it happen in my lifetime? Probably not. I'm not that good of a consultant for understanding that. but it's just working within the context, right? Some people just don't want it. I think there's so many misconceptions about, for one, cover crops, but also livestock on the land. A lot of bad management in the past gave cattle a bad eye, gave sheep a bad eye. I mean, oh my God, that's why they got a sheep's foot roller out there. But honestly, I love grazing sheep. I've run, that's my main enterprise is sheep along with my row crop operation, but I've had cattle too. And cattle are much easier to fence through some of these cover crops. But you want to talk about a way to recoup some of the value that you've just put out there. but also probably get back a 3-to-1 return on that, graze some animals across it, cycle that and stimulate that. Because what those animals are doing, not only are they depositing biology, as we talked about, how to increase and fast track biology. So you're getting that biology inoculant through your livestock, but you're also stimulating those plants to say, ouch, I'm injured. I'm going to send off more exudates here to feed biology because I need some repair work done here. So you're going to cycle some more photosynthetic activity and really just make that whole system crank. And it's just, boy, it just sounds like all cylinders are firing at the same time when you got the livestock integrated on that acre.
To me, the beauty of integrating livestock on the row crop acres is that you're just adding multiple benefits on top of each other. The one thing that it allows is for actually more diversity in the crop rotation. Now, a lot of people, we're always talking about it, how great it would be if you could get a small grain in the rotation, but the typical pushback we get is, well, that's great, but I can't make any money growing oats, or I can't make any money growing wheat. But if you can grow that crop and then you're harvesting midsummer and you've got the opportunity to come in there with a diverse, multi-species warm and cool season mix, and then graze that, well, there's your economic opportunity. That's how you make that third crop pay and make it pay very well. So then you also get the benefit again of you're more than likely going to get better corn and soybean yields or whatever crop you're growing in the off years. So you got to look at the profitability of the entire rotation, not just that 1 year where you're grazing. So it's a multiple year benefit.
And I'm sure it's the same in row crop as it is in livestock, that oftentimes the most productive operations are not the most profitable. The ones that have the highest yield, the ones that wean the most pounds, are not necessarily the most profitable because there are so many inputs that go into achieving that higher yield, that higher weaning weight on an individual animal basis, that the profit is eaten up by the amount of inputs it took to get there. Is that true in your experience?
I was going to say, the grazing can not only reduce cost, on the livestock side of it, obviously, we can get into that. There's all kinds of opportunities for stockpile grazing and, just keeping them out there longer, feeding less hay, huge economic benefit for the livestock, but also it can reduce your costs on the crop side as well. So you're getting, again, many, many benefits if you can integrate livestock over and above what it does for the soil.
Well, I mean, just think of talk about a roller crimper as a termination tool. Well, that's burning diesel and everything else that you've got going on there. Whereas the livestock can accomplish some of, maybe not quite as exactly efficiently, but they're also doing more than just laying cover down. They're processing those things and shooting, like you said, 70% of it out the back. And those things are probably better than just plain old carbon laid down on the soil at the end of the day.
Yep. Much better. Yep.
So, just, I guess, anything else there as far as the grazing, the cover crops and how that fits into a cash grain scenario that we've been talking about here for the most part?
Well, we touched on nutrient cycling earlier, but again, another huge benefit there. If you take a cover crop that naturally, if you just let it decompose and die, it might take 6 months or a year, whatever it is, for those nutrients to cycle back through that soil system. You run that through a cow, you just did it in 48 hours. Plus, you're adding a whole load of biology. I mean, a ruminant's digestive system is just absolutely full of organisms. The whole food web is in there, and it's a lot of the same organisms that live in the soil. So you're turbocharging, the biological activity in your soil when you run a grazing animal across that. So big benefits there on the nutrient cycling side as well. And you definitely should be taking a nutrient credit for that when you're going back to your cash crop.
Back to where we started, right? Speeding up biological time. We can do it with cover crops, but we can do it faster with cover crops integrating livestock as well into those acres.
Yeah. And one of the best things that I think about having livestock, or even just that diversity, diversity is key. We've talked about that. I've talked to a lot of guys that made it through the 80s, and they said the only thing that got them through the 80s was the diversity of enterprises on their operation. So livestock and cover crops, and even it doesn't even have to be your most productive ground. It can be some marginal land. Just get something established there. Where I'm at in my neck of the woods, in my context, a lot of timber soil. most guys are farming all the way up. They're scraping the planters, scraping the combines with the tree limbs, right? To me, that's not being a good steward of the land. That land is not to be row cropped. So maybe like myself, I've taken 30 feet all the way around at least on all my timber fields, and I've got a strip, if you will. I can either hay it, graze it, whatever, but I'm not putting those inputs out there. But it makes it easier for me to graze when I do get livestock in there. That livestock integration is just critical to help break the weed cycles. In our corn bean alternations, we're not in a rotation in our row crop world. It's alternating between corn and soybean for the most part. What a great way to break up weed cycles. Everybody talks about battling resistant weeds. Well, they're resistant because we've been doing the same dang thing for year in, year out, and our tools in the toolbox from a herbicide standpoint are running thin very fast. Water hemp is the bane of all row crop guys, especially here in the Midwest. And now they're finding HPPD resistant water hemp. Well, that's a bleacher, Callisto type product, right? So we relied on dicamba. Dicamba was the holy savior to come out. And that was towards the end of my ag retail days. And I can't think of in my opinion, what a worse product to come out with for already that had herbicide resistance built up to it, but what a fast track of what a herbicide resistance can build up to that. Even talking about layering herbicides, practices have been talked about that they're not effective. I mean, they're coming to an end at some point. Mother Nature will always win. And the only way we can efficiently break some of these cycles is through some of our cultural practices, not so much the chemical practices. That every herbicide out there is going to build resistance to it at some point. So we got to understand that. And if we can throw a cover crop in there and graze it, what a great way to break that weed cycle. But not only weed cycle, with some of the other things we battle, our diseases, our fungicides and things like that, we can start to reduce on by building some aggregation, getting some life back into that soil, building some oxygen into the soil. So, there's just so many benefits that can come with this, with proper management and understanding of what you want that system to be and do. It doesn't have to be farm scale to start out. It can be whatever comfort level you're happy with. But to me, it works, and it's a no-brainer for me.
Certainly. Anything else you want to say there as we wrap up? I think that's a great way to wrap it up. But Brian, anything else you want to say?
No, we covered a lot of ground. Yeah, I just encourage people to, if they've never planted a cover crop, just look into it. Start asking questions. If you got a neighbor that's doing it, talk to him, ask him what he's doing, learn from other people. Reach out to us if they have questions. It's just so fundamentally important to keep that living root in the soil as long as possible. And cover crops are definitely one of our main tools for accomplishing that, as well as, being able to integrate livestock into an operation in a profitable way. So give it a try.
Brian, I like how you ended that, Brian. You said we covered a lot of ground, but I hope we sure did. I hope we got a lot of people encouraged to plant some more cover crops. So.
Yeah, pun intended.
Yeah.
I like to say drill baby drill with cover crops.
I think that it is a system. What I'm realizing more and more is there isn't really one of the 6 principles of soil health that you can emphasize over the other. You talked about the importance of living roots, but you can't emphasize that over having armor on the soil, reducing disturbance, diversity, livestock integration, or your context. All of those things have to be there as well. And so the like you said, the cherry on top is to get them all together. And we'll never go as far as we could if we're skipping out on one of them. So, Luke and Brian, thank you guys for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Clay. Glad to do it.
Yep. Thanks for having us.
Very good stuff there with Brian and Luke. Really appreciate them. As I said, fresh off Soil Health Academy myself. Very practical course. Really enjoyed the course. Good mix of mornings in the classroom, afternoons out in the field, and just for, maybe it was just the number of things I've been exposed to over the years, or just the first time I really understood what we're looking at when we pull that soil plug out of the ground. Some of the different things that they were seeing, I was able to see them as well. And so I think, chalk that up to the teachers and the guys that were there pointing those things out to us along the way. So I encourage you to check out a Soil Health Academy coming your way near you, or worth the trip to go and track one down abroad as well. Coming up next week on the Working Cows podcast, we're going to talk to Jordan Steele. Jordan Steele is a member of a couple of different teams. He's a member of the team at Ranch Right. He's a member of the team at Ranch Management Consultants, and we're going to talk to him about forming entities, LLCs, S corps, C corps, and the like. So, what are the different considerations? What are the things to think about? What are the benefits, advantages, risks? All those things. Try to cover all facets of entities. Coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We will see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.